verse 16. Jesus is the fulfillment of that part of the promise. Now, when Jacob wakes up, and here's the vow. When Jacob wakes up from this dream, he takes this stone and he places it there as a memorial. And this is a pretty big rock that he places here. It's the type of rock that they use to set at the boundary between you and your neighbors. One of these big rocks here. And so he places it there, and he calls the name Bethel, Bethel, the house of God. And Jacob makes this vow, verse 20. He says, if God will be with me, and he will keep me on this journey that I take, and will give me food to eat and garments to wear, and I return to my father's house in safety, then the Lord will be my God. This stone, which I have set up as a pillar, will be God's house, Bethel, God's house. And of all that you give me, I will surely give you a tenth of it all. Now, if you think giving 10% today is hard, imagine what it would be like if everything you had was right there in front of you. And you had to make sure you had enough male and female cattle to take care of you through the rest of the year, through all of the season, through the hard winter times, and all into the next year until the next season that you would have the next, whatever you call it, baby lambs and bulls and everything. Litter, you don't call it litter, but whatever. The baby ones. And he says, I'm going to give a tenth of it to God. What trust, what sacrifice. And so before, Esau was dependent upon Jacob for this bowl of lentils, but Jacob now is dependent on God for everything. He is out there separated from his family with nothing except him and God. That's why this vow is the turning point when Jacob begins to trust God. Now, he's persevering through this life. He's out there on his own because he's deceived his brother and his dad. I mean, he's suffering from his own decisions. But he doesn't turn his back on God. In chapter 30, he comes to his uncle's house, and this is the story where he sees his uncle Laban, and sees his daughter Rachel, and he falls in love with Rachel, and Laban says, well, you come work for me. What are your wages? And Jacob says, well, I'll work 7 years for your daughter Rachel. And so he does so. 7 years later, Laban has a wedding ceremony, and it's dark, and it's time for the bride to go into the tent and consummate the wedding ceremony, consummate the marriage. And Jacob wakes up the next morning, and lo and behold, it's Leah that he's been married to, and not Rachel, the oldest daughter. So he's mad. He says, Laban, you tricked me. Well, guess what? Jacob's hidden what's coming to him, hasn't he? He's been deceiving other people, and now he's on the receiving end of it. And so Laban says, well, here's what I'll do. I'll give you Rachel if you swear to me that you'll work another 7 years. And so Jacob says, I'll work another 7 years. And so he goes ahead and gets Rachel as his wife, and so he works another 7 years, 14 years. And through those 2 women and then their 2 maids, God blesses Jacob with 12 sons and 1 daughter. Now, the oldest is Leah, and she gives Jacob the first 4 sons. God closes up Rachel's womb so that she can't have any children right now. Well, then she gets jealous because Leah's having all these children, and so she gives her handmaid to Jacob to have a couple of boys, and he has a couple of boys through her, through Bilhah, Dan and Naphtali, and then Leah says, well, I can play that game. So she gives her handmaid to Jacob and says, well, you can have some sons by her. And so Jacob has another 2 by Zilpah. And doesn't this sound like a soap opera? And so now Rachel says, well, looks what's going on. And so now Leah has 2 more sons, and then a daughter, Dinah, the only daughter that Jacob has. And then finally God opens Rachel's womb. And Rachel has a son who she names Joseph. Yosef is the Hebrew word for to add. And so even as she's having this son, and she's been married up to this point, she names him a word that means God's going to give you another one. God's going to add to this one. And so Rachel has Joseph and Benjamin. Now these 12 sons are the heart of the Israelite nation. These 12 sons form the 12 tribes of Israel, and that becomes the nation of Israel later once they go down into Egypt. Okay, well, God appears to Jacob and he says, Jacob, I want you to go back home now. Jacob has been gone from home for 20 years, 2 decades. Jacob is on his way home. He sends out a party to find out about Esau, his brother. It's been 20 years. Jacob says, well, Esau is still bearing a grudge. And so he sends out messengers. The messengers come back and say, well, Esau's coming to meet you, and he's got 400 men with him. And Jacob says, oh, no. And so he divides up his family, his wives. He puts his favorite wife, Rachel, and Joseph at the back. And he presents some presents. He gets some presents ready to give to Esau as a peace offering. But the night before he meets Esau, chapter 32, Jacob wrestles with an angel. And in the wrestling of the angel, Jacob is pretty strong. I guess God allows Jacob to be stronger than the angel. My guess is the angel's stronger than Jacob, but God allows Jacob to get the upper hand. But then in the process of this wrestling with the angel of God, God changes Jacob's name to Israel. Jacob means heel grabber. Jacob means supplanter. Jacob means selfish. But Israel means a servant of God. And so God changes Jacob's name from Jacob to Israel. Now I want you to look over at chapter 35. In the meantime, between chapter 2 and chapter 32 and chapter 35, Jacob meets Esau. Esau has forgotten all about the past. He's let bygones be bygones. He says, we are brothers. Let's have peace between us. And so Jacob comes and he lives in, he comes back and lives at Bethel, chapter 35, verse 1. This is the place where he had the vision of the angels. And so God tells Jacob in verse 2, chapter 35, put away the foreign gods from you. Put away your foreign gods. You come into a new land, put your past behind you. Put your past, bury Jacob, and now be Israel. Now let's pick up at verse 9. So God appeared to Jacob again when he came from Padan Aram, and he blessed him. And God said to him, your name is Jacob. You shall no longer be called Jacob, but Israel shall be your name. And so he called him Israel. And God also said to him, I am God Almighty, be fruitful and multiply. Notice Jacob has already had 12 sons and 1 daughter. He's got 13 children, but God says, be fruitful and multiply. God is not telling Jacob to have more children. Jacob's not going to have any more children, in fact. But what he's going to do is have grandchildren and great-grandchildren and a multitude of descendants by faith. A nation and a company of nations shall come from you, and kings shall come from you. The kings will come through his son Judah. And ultimately Jesus the Christ, the Lion of the tribe of Judah, will come through Judah and Jacob. And then verse 12, the land which I gave to Abraham and Isaac I will give to you, and I will give the land to your descendants after you. A lot of examples in the Old Testament are stories where a people began great and ended badly. Jacob is an example of the opposite of that. Jacob began his life badly. He began his life sowing his wild oats, so to speak, serving himself, going after what he could get. He winds up suffering for it on a number of occasions. But he perseveres, especially after taking that vow to God. And he comes back and he's faithful to God. So much so, in fact, turn over to chapter 48. Chapter 48 is at the end of Jacob's life. Hebrews chapter 11 and verse 21, the hall of faith, the Hebrew writer says that by faith Jacob blessed his son Joseph, leaning on his staff and worship. What's he talking about? At the very end of Jacob's life, Jacob has now gone down into Egypt because of the famine, and Jacob's lived there for a number of years, about 17 years, I believe. But Jacob believes that his children, his grandchildren, the later generations are going to return back to the promised land because God said He would bring them back. So Genesis chapter 48, first of all, verses 15 and 16. Jacob is blessing his son Joseph. He's the one that saved the family from the famine in the first place. So he blessed Joseph and he said, the God before whom my fathers Abraham and Isaac walked, the God who has been my shepherd. Underline that. God has always been the shepherd of His people. The God who has been my shepherd all my life to this day, the angel who has redeemed me from all evil, Gilead, Joseph's sons, Manasseh and Ephraim, and may my name live on in them, and the names of my fathers Abraham and Isaac, and may they grow into a multitude in the midst of the earth. He doesn't know that they're going to serve in Egypt as slaves for 430 years, but he believes that they will leave Egypt and go back home. Look over at chapter 49 real quick. Chapter 49. This is at the very end of Jacob's life. He's blessed all of his sons. Joseph's two sons, Ephraim and Manasseh, he blessed them and raised them to the same level as his own children. As far as inheritance is concerned, he's made them co-heirs with all of his other sons. And so verse 29, he charged them and said, I'm about to be gathered to my people. That's what happens when Christians die. They go back to their people, the saints who are with God in heaven. He says, I'm about to be gathered to my people. Bury me with my fathers in the cave that is in the field of Ephraim the Hittite, and the cave that is in the field of Machpelah, which is before Mamre, the land of Canaan, which Abraham bought along with the field from Ephraim the Hittite for a burial site. There they buried Abraham and his wife Sarah. There they buried Isaac and his wife Rebekah. There I buried Leah. And the field and the cave that is in it purchased from the sons of Heth. He's in Egypt. And he tells his boys, you carry me back and bury me so that I can be in my homeland. When Jacob finished charging his sons, he drew his feet into the bed, breathed his last, and was gathered to his people. Jacob persevered to the end because he had faith in God. He believed that God would fulfill his promises that he gave to Jacob. He said, I'm here in the foreign land of Egypt, and I'm going home. Joseph does the same thing at the end of the next chapter, very similar to his dad. When Joseph dies, he says, when you leave Egypt, you carry my bones back home and bury me in the land of Canaan. 430 years later, the Israelites carried Joseph's bones, and after Joshua enters the promised land and conquers the promised land, the Bible says that he buried Joseph in Canaan, persevering to the end. The New Testament teaches us that we need to persevere in a number of different texts. For example, in Ephesians chapter 6 and verse 18, the Apostle Paul says that we need to pray and keep our faith with all perseverance. The word persevere comes from a Latin word, per and severe, that means through trials. If you persevere, then you make it through trials. Through the hard times, you keep going. Now, we struggle in this life. We struggle with physical pain. We struggle with spiritual pain. We struggle with setbacks. We struggle with temptations. But the Bible's message is, go through it. Don't give up. Don't stop. When you fall down, pick yourself up. If you fall off the horse, get back on. Keep going. Persevere. In Acts chapter 1 and verse 14, especially Colossians 4 verse 2, write down Colossians 4 and verse 2 especially. Persevere in prayer. The New American Standard translates the verb actually as devote yourselves to prayer. The original word means persevere. Persevere in prayer. God, I messed up. Keep praying. God, I fell down. Keep praying. Romans 12 and verse 12, Paul says that we need to persevere through tribulation. Stick with it. When times get hard, don't give up. Stick with it. Just like Jacob did. In Acts 2 verse 42, the text says that the first century Christians persevered in the apostles' doctrine and fellowship and breaking of bread and communion, Lord's Supper, and prayers. So they persevered in worship. God is hard to get up and go to worship on Sunday. Persevere. Keep devoting yourselves to worship. Persevere. Just like Jacob. And then finally, in Acts chapter 6 and verse 4, this is where the first deacons were appointed in the church in order to take care of the widows. We mentioned those briefly last week, I believe. To take care of the widows. And the apostle said, the deacons need to take care of that so that we can devote ourselves, that is, persevere in the ministry of the Word